إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهدي الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله ثم أما بعد أيها الإخوة والأخوات السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. We begin by praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, seeking His divine aid, seeking His assistance. Whomsoever Allah Azza wa Jal guides, none can misguide, and whomsoever Allah Azza wa Jal misguides, none can guide. I bear witness that none has right to be worshipped except Allah Azza wa Jal alone without any partner, and I testify that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam is His final prophet and messenger. As for proceeded, inshallah, we continue our series discussing the life of the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wassalam. Muhammad as if you can see him. A class inshallah whereby we familiarize ourselves with the shama'il of the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wassalam. A class wherein we familiarize ourselves with the various characteristics of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. His description, what was his living like, what was his character like, and so on and so forth. And this is something which is incumbent upon each and every single Muslim to learn about Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the final messenger who Allah Azza wa Jal has sent as a mercy to all of mankind. So for what reason do we learn about the life of the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam? For one specific reason, and that is to emulate him in his character, to emulate him in his worship, and to emulate him in terms of his akhlaq sallallahu alayhi wasallam. As Allah Azza wa Jalla tells us in his book, and he says, لَقَدْ كَانَ لَكُمْ فِي رَسُولِ اللَّهِ أُسْوَةٌ حَسَنَةٌ لِمَنْ كَانَ يَرْجُو اللَّهَ وَالْيَوْمَ الْآخِرَةَ وَذَكَرَ اللَّهَ كَثِيرًا. Indeed, in the Messenger of Allah alayhi salatu wasalam, to you, O Muslims, have a perfect example. For the one who believes in Allah and is mindful of the last day and remembers Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala often, these are the people who find a good qudwa, a good example in the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. And so it is an obligation upon us as Muslims to learn about the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam's various characteristics and to implement them bi'idhnillah. And this is the objective of this class. So inshallah, the first chapter we will discuss today inshallah, it is the chapter concerning Buka'ur Rasuli sallallahu alayhi wasallam, the crying of the Messenger of Allah alayhi salatu wasalam. That yes, O dear Muslims, the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam, he shed tears. But what was the reason for him shedding tears? The Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam was the most devoted of servants to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He reached the level of true ubudiyah and the highest level of servitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And part of this servitude was him being mindful and fearful of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And for this reason, at certain moments, the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam, he shed tears. So the tears the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam shed, it was for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sometimes these tears was as a result of him showing mercy to the deceased person. That the tears of the Prophet Muhammad was a mercy for the deceased person. At other times, the Prophet Muhammad wept out of fear for his ummah, what lied ahead for them. Sometimes this tears the Prophet Muhammad shed, it was out of khashya, for the sake of Allah. It was out of having this fear of Allah Azza wa Jal, which was based upon knowledge. And sometimes the Prophet Muhammad he shed tears when listening to the Quran. And sometimes the Prophet Muhammad shed tears when those whom were beloved around him passed on alayhi salatu wassalam. And so this is a human characteristic, to shed tears. But sometimes the reason why we shed tears, it should be motivated by doing it for the sake of Allah and doing it out of fear for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so the first hadith which comes up in this chapter, it was when the Prophet Muhammad was sitting, and he was sitting in the company of a great companion by the name of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiallahu ta'ala anhu. And the Prophet Muhammad told him the following words: Iqra alayya, read to me. Read to me, meaning read the Quran. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, out of astonishment, he replies in the following manner, and he says, Aqra'u alayka wa alayka unzil. How can I read to you when the Quran was revealed to you, O Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam? The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam gave him the reasoning behind this, and he said, Uhibbu an asma'u min ghayri. I like to hear the recitation of the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from other than me. And as we see, this is a benefit that sometimes when a person reads the Quran by himself, for the one who understands it, and for those who do not understand it at certain times, it has an effect upon them. And sometimes when the Quran is read by someone else and we hear it, it has a specific effect on us. And so Abdullah ibn Mas'ud began reciting to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and he recited Surah An-Nisa up until he reached the verse where Allah Azza wa Jal says in verse 41, فَكَيْفَ إِذَا جِئْنَا مِنْ كُلِّ أُمَّةٍ بِشَهِيدٍ وَجِئْنَا بِكَ عَلَى هَؤُلَاءِ شَهِيدًا. So how will it be, O Muhammad ﷺ, when we come with each and every single ummah, we bring a witness over them. Each and every single prophet that was sent to the nation will be a witness over that particular nation. And then Allah Azza wa Jal says, وَجِئْنَا بِكَ عَلَى هَؤُلَاءِ شَهِيدًا. And we bring you, O Muhammad ﷺ, as a witness over your nation. That great responsibility lied and rested on the shoulders of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is described in a situation, and he says, Hasbuk al-an. The Prophet Muhammad told Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, sufficient is this. Yani, stop at this point. At this moment, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiallahu ta'ala, he turns to the Prophet ﷺ, and he says, فَإِذَا عَيْنَا تَضْرِفَانِ. And he discovers that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ's eyes was filled up with tears, and the tears was flowing, alayhi salatu wasalam. And this hadith is found in Bukhari and Muslim. It is muttafaqun alayh. So what do we benefit from this hadith? Firstly, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he shed tears, and he shed these tears for the sake of Allah, realizing, recognizing his responsibility of conveying this message to the ummah, and that he will be brought as a witness over this ummah. And so the Prophet ﷺ, he shed tears because of this taklif, this responsibility which was placed over him. Secondly, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ told Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, Hasbuk al-an. He told him, stop here, and this is sufficient. And the Prophet ﷺ did not say, which commonly flows on the tongues of those who recite the Quran when they complete the recitation, Sadaqallahu al-Azim. Even though the meaning carries the correct meaning, this is not a statement which the Prophet ﷺ encouraged us to say, that Allah Azza wa Jalla has spoken the truth. And so it is for us to stick to the guidance of the Prophet ﷺ in each and every single aspect which relates to our religion. Whether it relates to our beliefs, whether it relates to our actions, or whether it relates to our statements. And so the Prophet ﷺ said, he said, Hasbuk al-an. He said, sufficient is this. The third benefit we benefit from this hadith is that the Prophet ﷺ, he loved listening to the Quran from other than himself. Yes, we know Jibreel came to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and he brought revelation. And the Prophet heard the revelation from Jibreel alayhi salatu wasalam. At other times, the Prophet ﷺ loved that his companions recite the Quran to him. And we mentioned that this is for two reasons. Firstly, the effect of the Quran on the person. When the person recites by himself, he feels khashya. He feels this fear of Allah Azza wa Jal overcoming. when he recites, for example, verses which relate to the punishment of Allah, and he feels happiness at certain times when he recites verses which relate to the rewards of Allah Azza wa Jal and Jannah and so on and so forth. And so the effect the Quran has on the person when he recites by himself, the Quran takes effect on him. And secondly, sometimes when a person hears the Quran being recited by a different reciter, it has a different effect on him. And this is true. When we listen to the great Qur'an of this ummah, and we can mention some names, those such as Khalil Khusri, so many Qur'an. When they recite the Quran and you listen to it, it has an effect on you. It overwhelms you, right? And this is the effect of the Quran by way of this person reciting this. The fourth benefit that we benefit from this hadith is that when the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, heard the Quran being recited, he started crying. However, he did not wail, right, in terms of making a loud noise or crying in a sense where he was overcome with fear, right? Rather, the Prophet ﷺ, his tears flowed, and this was a silent type of crying. It was not a type of wailing, because this is not something which is encouraged, something which is known as siyah, crying with a loud and audible tone. Okay, sometimes a person is overwhelmed and he cannot keep back his emotion. However, the cry which the Prophet also did when it relates to worship of Allah and the Quran, it is described as buka. And buka is crying without a sound emanating from the person. Taib. The next hadith which displays to us the Prophet Muhammad's tears and the tears which he shed for the sake of Allah, it is the hadith which describes to us the death of the Prophet Muhammad's son Ibrahim. The companions of the Messenger of Allah ﷺ enters upon the Prophet, peace be upon him. And the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is holding his son Ibrahim. The Prophet ﷺ kisses him and the Prophet ﷺ smiles him. At this moment, the companions find that Ibrahim ﷺ had passed on. And this caused the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ to cry. This caused the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ to cry. As we mentioned, crying, it is a human characteristic, and the Prophet ﷺ, he was a human being in the sense of the word, that he felt emotions, and that he ate, and that he slept, and that he got married. So the Prophet ﷺ experienced these type of emotions. And so this, the passing on of the son of the Prophet ﷺ, it caused him to shed tears. And so the companions became astonished at this. This is the Messenger of Allah, and he cries. And Abdurrahman ibn Auf radiallahu anhu, he said, "Wa anta ya Rasulullah, yani tabki," that you, O Messenger of Allah, you cry. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ gave us a beautiful response that we even use up until this very day when we lose loved ones and when we console those people who are mourning the loss of family members. The Prophet said, "Innaha rahmatun," that the tears which the Prophet ﷺ specifically sheds, it is a rahmah. And we mentioned this in the beginning. The Prophet then went on to say, "Innal ayna tadma," the eyes, it sheds tears. "Wal qalba yahzan," and the heart, it grieves. وَلَا نَقُولُ إِلَّا مَا يُرْضِي رَبَّنَا. However, we do not say except that which pleases Allah Azza wa Jal. We don't mention words of displeasure of the decree of Allah. Why did Allah take my father? Why did Allah cause my mother to die? Why me? Why am I facing this difficulty? We only say at the time of mourning and grieving that which pleases Allah Azza wa Jal. وَإِنَّا بِفِرَاقِكَ يَا إِبْرَاهِيمَ لَمَحْزُونُونَ. And we are, by your departure, O Ibrahim, we are grieving about this. And so this is a natural characteristic, a natural human characteristic, to cry. However, our tears, it has to be guided by the guidance of Allah and His Messenger. And so we are allowed to grieve over our loved ones when they pass on. But this grieving and mourning, it must be guided by the Quran and the Sunnah. So the Prophet gave this explanation and he said, "Innaha rahmatun," that this is a mercy. The eye shed tears and the heart grieves, but we do not say that except which pleases Allah Azza wa Jal. So what do we benefit from this hadith? Firstly, it is permissible to cry over the deceased. And we mentioned the type of crying should not be sarrah nor nawah, wailing and lamenting over the dead, as we see some people do at the time of funerals. Wallahu musta'an. Those who are not guided by Allah Azza wa Jal, we find them that they grieve in excess by doing certain things. A trait of jahiliyyah, people slap their faces when they lose loved ones, and they tear open their clothing and they wail and they lament over the dead. For example, hanging on the coffin of the mayyit, right? Going into excess with regard to this matter. This is not from the guidance of Islam, nor from the guidance of the Quran and the Sunnah. Secondly, it is permissible to grieve over the dead. It is permissible to grieve over the dead with refraining from speech which is indicative of the displeasure of the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is the response of a Muslim. Whenever we are faced with a trial or calamity and we face some form of loss, example, a loss of a loved one, we say inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. And this is the first response of a believer. And your internal feelings, you might be unable to control them, but on the external, we do not show that we are displeased with the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is the response generally of Muslims, walillahi alhamd. So it is permissible to grieve for the dead, but we need to refrain from speech which is indicative of showing the displeasure of Allah Azza wa Jal's decree. Thirdly, crying, it is a mercy. It is a mercy from Allah given to the person to express his emotions, and from the Prophet ﷺ, this crying, it is a mercy for the deceased person. Fourthly, we also learn that when we are faced with a calamity, we are encouraged to show sabr and al-ihtisab. We are encouraged to show patience, and we need to seek reward for the loss that we are faced with. Inna lillahi ma akhadh wa lahu ma a'ta wa kulla shay'in indahu bi ajlin musamma faltasbir wal tahtasib. Be patient for your loss and seek reward for the loss. It's a trial, and if you pass the trial by submitting to Allah and showing patience, you will be rewarded, inshallah. And so these are some of the ahadith which shows us the Prophet Muhammad's servitude to Allah. And part of that servitude was that he shed tears for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at certain times. The next chapter we'd like to discuss, it is the chapter concerning the akhlaq, the character of the Messenger of Allah alayhi salatu wasalam, which is a great chapter. And we mentioned in the beginning that the reason why we study the life of the Prophet and his shama'il, his characteristics, is for one reason and one reason only, and that is to emulate him. And that part of being a good Muslim means to have a good character. Being a Muslim does not only mean praying 5 times a day, fasting the month of Ramadan, giving zakat, and doing these rituals. Part of being a good Muslim is also, coupled with this, fulfilling these obligations, it also means to show good character. So sometimes we have Muslims who have the best of external appearances. In terms of the apparent, they follow the Sunnah. They dress according to the Sunnah. They grow their beards. They cover up as they ought to cover up. However, the character, it sucks. And the character is not in line with the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. So part of being a good Muslim means to fulfill the obligations, and part of fulfilling the obligations is to have good character. Part of fulfilling the obligations is to have good character. And so the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was the pinnacle of good character, as Allah Azza wa Jal tells us about him, وَإِنَّكَ لَعَلَى خُلُقٍ عَظِيمٍ. O Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you are upon an exalted standard of character. And the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam used to supplicate to Allah Azza wa Jal to grant him good character. And so we see that character, it is hibatul min Allah, it is a gift from Allah. Like Allah Azza wa Jal makes taqseem, He divides the rizq, He divides provisions amongst His servants. Part of that provision, it is good character. Part of that provision, it is Islamic knowledge. Part of that provision is having the correct belief. So like we implore Allah Azza wa Jal to fulfill our needs, our dunyawi needs, we also need to supplicate to Allah Azza wa Jal to grant us those things which are good for us and which makes us lead to His Jannah and to His pleasure. And the Prophet ﷺ was a perfect example of this. The Prophet ﷺ used to supplicate, Allahumma hdini li ahsani al-a'mal wa ahsani al-akhlaq la yahdi li ahsaniha illa ant. A common supplication the Prophet used to make, he used to say, oh Allah, guide me to the best of deeds and actions, wa ahsani al-akhlaq, and guide me to the best form of character, la yahdi li ahsaniha illa ant. No one guides towards this except you. So this is a gift from Allah, and we need to seek it from Allah. Certain people, their general nature and the natural way they've been created is that they are gentle and they are easygoing. Some people have been created in a different way. They might be a bit hot-headed, or they might have a temper. Does this mean we give in to that characteristic? No, we need to fight it, and we need to learn to control it. So how do we obtain this? By seeking help from Allah through the supplications of the Prophet ﷺ. Allahumma hadini li ahsani al-a'mali wa ahsani al-akhlaq la yahdi li ahsaniha illa ant. Oh Allah, guide me towards good deeds and righteous actions, and guide me towards the best of character. No one guides to the best of them except you. And so when we look at the life of the Prophet ﷺ, it was fulfillment of this goal of good character. The Prophet said, إِنَّمَا بُئِثْتُ لِأُتَمِّمَ مَكَارِمَ الْأَخْلَاقِ. I was only sent to perfect the model standard of character. One of the main goals, not the main goal of the coming of the Prophet, as some people claim, but rather one of the main goals of the sending of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was to raise and to perfect the model standard of character. Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So when it comes to khuluq, it is that which is attached to a person's internal nature. Khuluq can be something which is of an internal nature. So for example, to have fear of Allah, to have taqwa, to have sabr, to have tawakkul. This is all part of good character. And this good character, it is with Allah first. Right? This good character, this form of good character, it is the right of Allah first. All of these deeds, sabr, tawakkul, khashya, khawf, taqwa, this is all the right of Allah. And this is good character with Allah. The second form of character is that which is upon the apparent. That which is upon the apparent of a person. Such as having a pleasant appearance, having a cheerful face, being generous, being kind, being respectful, and so on and so forth. This is got to do with the person's apparent nature. So akhlaq can either be that which is internal, and that is with Allah Azza wa Jal, sabr, and all of these things we mentioned, or it can be something which is upon the external. As we mentioned, all those examples, being generous, being kind, being cheerful, being easygoing, and so on and so forth. And so the pinnacle of this was the Messenger of Allah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Allah Azza wa Jal describes him and gives one of the descriptions of the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, and also mentions to us the reason why Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam reached this exalted set of character. Allah mentioned in Al Imran verse 159, فَبِمَا رَحْمَةٍ مِّنَ اللَّهِ لِنْتَ لَهُمْ وَلَوْ كُنْتَ فَظًّا غَلِيظَ الْقَلْبِ لَانْفَضُّوا مِنْ حَوْلِكَ فَاعْفُ عَنْهُمْ وَاسْتَغْفِرْ لَهُمْ وَشَاوِرْهُمْ فِي الْأَمْرِ فَإِذَا عَزَمْتَ فَتَوَكَّلْ عَلَى اللَّهِ إِنَّ اللَّهَ يُحِبُّ الْمُتَوَكِّلِينَ. Allah mentioned that had it not been for the mercy of Allah Azza wa Jal upon you, that Allah Azza wa Jal guided you toward this, linta lahum, you showed gentleness and kindness towards your companions. This was a minna min Allah, it was a gift from Allah that Allah gave the Prophet ﷺ, that he showed gentleness to his followers. And Allah mentioned, وَلَوْ كُنْتَ فَظًّا غَلِيظَ الْقَلْبِ لَانْفَضُّوا مِنْ حَوْلِكَ, and had you been harsh, غَلِيظَ الْقَلْبِ, and hard-hearted towards him, لَانْفَضُّوا مِنْ حَوْلِكَ, then they would have fled from you, they would have fled from your company. فَاعْفُ عَنْهُمْ وَاسْتَغْفِرْ لَهُمْ, so pardon them and seek forgiveness for their shortcomings. And this is an important characteristic of a Muslim, let alone a student of knowledge, of Islamic knowledge, and a leader. Sometimes we find that those who possess lots of knowledge of fiqh and hadith and tafsir, but in terms of their character, it sucks, wallahu musta'an, and they are the most distant from the guidance of the Prophet ﷺ in terms of character. So this goes hand in hand. Being a leader and having this quality of gentleness and this quality of being light-hearted and this quality of being easygoing, it is a characteristic that a leader must possess. Because if you were to interact with people in a harsh nature, people will flee from you, and when they flee from you, they also flee from the knowledge which you possess. And so knowledge and good character goes hand in hand. But first and foremost, be a good Muslim, and good character goes hand in hand. So Allah mentions that if the Prophet was to be harsh and hard-hearted, the companions would have fled from him. So Allah says فَاعْفُ عَنْهُمْ, so seek forgiveness for their shortcomings and pardon them and overlook their shortcomings and seek forgiveness for it. Allah mentions an important quality also, وَشَاوِرْهُمْ فِي الْأَمْرِ, and seek their counsel with regards to important matters. And this was the Prophet ﷺ's methodology, that when it came to important matters which affected his companions and his ummah, he would seek the counsel of his companions. Like for example, the Battle of Uhud, the Prophet ﷺ, before he made a decision, when he heard that the Quraysh and the emissaries were approaching Medina and coming for the sake of battle, the first thing the Prophet ﷺ did was he consulted with his companions. And when a person who is a leader or in a leadership position does this, it causes the people to have more interest in his decisions. Since they also gave their input in this, the final outcome will be accepted amongst all. So Allah commands the Prophet, وَشَاوِرْهُمْ فِي الْأَمْرِ, that seek their counsel with regards to important matters. فَإِذَا عَزَمْتَ فَتَوَكَّلْ عَلَى اللَّهِ إِنَّ اللَّهَ يُحِبُّ الْمُتَوَكِّلِينَ. However, once you have made a firm decision, then you place your trust in Allah, for Allah Azza wa Jal loves those who place their trust in Him subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so this verse gives us a description of the Prophet ﷺ when it came to his interaction with his companions alayhi salatu wassalam. Another verse that shows us the great character of the Prophet ﷺ is the verse where Allah Azza wa Jal said, وَإِنَّكَ لَعَلَى خُلُقٍ عَظِيمٍ, a praise from Allah Azza wa Jal min fawqi sab'a samawat, from above 7 heavens, praising the character of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that indeed, O you Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you are upon an exalted standard of character. Imagine, this tazkiyah is given from your Creator, and this tazkiyah is given to the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam, praising the character of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. A narration that describes to us the character of the Prophet ﷺ is a narration which is often quoted, and that is when Sayyidina Aisha radiallahu anha was asked about the character of the Prophet, she described it in the best of manners. And who better to describe the character of the Prophet than his wives, those who were intimate with him and lived with him very closely and saw his habits, let alone the people outside who described the character of the Prophet ﷺ. What did those people who were closest to the Prophet ﷺ mention about him? Because that truly is the person you are. Sometimes we find, and this is a common complaint, that a person, he has good character outside of the home, but inside of the house he has the worst of character towards those people who should mean the most to him and where it counts the most, his wife, his kids, his parents. So the Prophet ﷺ, what was he described as by Sayyidina Aisha? She said, كَانَ خُلُقُهُ الْقُرْآنِ, that the Prophet ﷺ's character, it was like that of the Quran. The Prophet's character was like the blueprint of the Quran. Every single good action that was commanded in the Quran, the Prophet ﷺ was the embodiment of that. Each and every single action that was declared to be a sin, transgression, and a bad deed by Allah Azza wa Jal, then the Prophet ﷺ would be the most distant from that. And so the Prophet ﷺ was the embodiment of the Quran. He was like a walking Quran in terms of his character and in terms of him practicing upon the revelation. What describes to us the Prophet ﷺ's character is a hadith that also mentions that the most detested of character to the Prophet ﷺ was that of kadhib, was that of lies. And this is considered to be a deed of the tongue. And this is part of our deeds. Some people do not consider their speech to be part of their deeds. However, speech is part of our deeds. And the Prophet said about kadhib, it is akdhabul hadith. It is the worst of speech. One of the major sins is that of the tongue, and it is that of lying. So this was the most detested characteristic to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and that was lying. What also gives us an understanding of the character of the Prophet ﷺ is that it's mentioned that the Prophet ﷺ was not fahishan wala mutafahishan. The Prophet ﷺ, he never indulged in vain talk. The Prophet ﷺ never spoke in a vain manner, and he never indulged in vain talk. Wala mutafahishan. Nor was the Prophet ﷺ, nor would he engage in vain actions. So the Prophet ﷺ never spoke in a vain manner, and he never ever acted in a vain manner. Wala la'anan. Nor was the Prophet ﷺ someone who cursed often. وَكَانَ يَقُولُ, and he used to say, إِنَّ مِنْ خِيَرِكُمْ أَحْسَنُكُمْ أَخْلَاقًا. And the Prophet ﷺ would say that the best of you are those who have the best of character. The true measure of a person in terms of him, after he fulfills the obligations, what shows us that this person is a good person is good character. This, of course, after he believes in Allah and he fulfills the obligations. And why do we make mention of this? Because sometimes we mention that there are some people, those who disbelieve in Allah, we describe them as having better character than the believers. However, this is not true, because the greatest of character is the character we share with Allah, and the greatest character means to single Allah Azza wa Jal out in worship and to abstain from shirk, to abstain from ascribing partners with Allah Azza wa Jal in worship. And so we mention this, and we hear this often, that people will say, those people, yani the kuffar, they have better character than the Muslims. Sometimes there is some truth to this. However, if a person truly believes in Allah and fulfills the obligations, you must find that this person also follows through with good character. So people will say that these people have better character than the Muslims. However, this cannot be true, because they have the worst of character with their Creator first and foremost. So inna min khiyarikum ahsanukum akhlaqan. The best of you are those who have the best of character. And if the person is mindful of Allah and he has khashya and he has khawf, fear of Allah, then naturally you should fulfill this obligation of good character. Otherwise there is a discrepancy in one's worship. May Allah Azza wa Jal grant us the understanding of this. A beautiful description of the Messenger of Allah والسلام, is that which was given by the Prophet's Khadim, his servant Anas ibn Malik. Anas ibn Malik radiallahu anhu was a young boy when the Prophet came to Medina. And Anas's mother, she gifted Anas to the Prophet to be in the service of the Prophet. So Anas would leave his home in the early part of the morning, and he would serve the Prophet the entire day, and then he would return to his home. So he spent lots of time in the company of the Prophet and learning about the Prophet's intimate habits that others would not have known about, how the Prophet was in his household. And so he describes the Prophet and he says, لم يكن رسول الله ولم يكن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم فاحشا ولا لعانا ولا سبابا وكان يقول عند المعتبة ما له ترب جبينه. طيب. So he says the Prophet was never one to talk in a vain manner and to act in a vain manner, nor was he one who cursed, nor was he one who made sab, nor was he one who swore. وَكَانَ يَقُولُ عِنْدَ الْمُعَتَّبَ, and he used to say, when he would rebuke someone, how would the Prophet react? He would say, مَا لَهُ تَرِبَ جَبِينُهُ. He would say, what is the matter with this person? May his forehead be rubbed in dust. This is how the Prophet would act when he would rebuke someone. He wouldn't react in a manner where he would curse a person or where he would swear the person out or act in a vain manner, but he would say, مَا لَهُ تَرِبَ جَبِينُهُ. What's the matter with this person? May his forehead be placed in turab, in sand. And so this is the description of Anas ibn Malik radiallahu anhu, who said, خدمت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم 10 سنين فما قال لي أف قط. He said, I served the Prophet. In some narrations it mentions 9 years, in other narrations it mentions 10 years. And he said the Prophet also never ever rebuked me, never ever said to me qat. He never ever said uff, which is like adna al kalima. It is the lowest form of speech which could be indicative of someone's displeasure. And so he never ever reacted like this to Anas radiallahu ta'ala anhu. The Prophet Muhammad also in a narration Bukhari is described, and it is mentioned, كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم أحسن الناس وجها وأحسنهم خلقا. The Prophet ﷺ, he had the most beautiful and most handsome of faces, and this we will get to inshallah when we describe the description of the Prophet ﷺ. He had the most beautiful of appearance, and he had the most beautiful face. وَأَحْسَنَهُمْ خُلُقًا, and he also had the best of character. Subhanallah. So the Prophet's outer appearance was one of adornment and one of beauty, and this was complemented by his character as well on the external, the way he treated people, the way he interacted with people, the mercy which he showed, the gentleness which he showed to those around him. So his outer appearance was complemented by his good character. And sometimes you find a person has been gifted, mashallah, tabarakallah, good looks by Allah Azza wa Jal, and been given a handsome or a beautiful appearance, but this person's character sucks. And so this causes the person's physical description also to diminish in the sight of people. So the Prophet's outer appearance was complemented by his good character. Subhanallah. Another narration that describes to us the characteristics of the Prophet is the hadith of Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, wherein he mentioned, it was said to the Prophet Muhammad Ud'u ala al-mushrikeen, supplicate against the polytheists, the mushrikeen. And the Prophet said, Inni lam ubath la'anan wa innama bu'ithtu rahmatan. He said, I was not sent as one to curse, But Allah Azza wa Jal did not send me to curse, but rather I was sent as a mercy. However, this in the absolute sense is not true, because there were times when the Prophet ﷺ also cursed certain people, and when the Prophet ﷺ made dua against certain people, and this of course was when there was a need for that. So this narration mentions, I was not sent as one to curse, but I was sent as a mercy. This was in a certain context, and this was the general approach of the Prophet. However, there were specific times when there was a need that the Prophet ﷺ actually supplicated against the mushrikeen and the enemies of Allah Azza wa Jal. And this is mentioned in Sahih Muslim. Another important characteristic of the Prophet ﷺ is that the Prophet ﷺ كان يتفاءل. The Prophet ﷺ would become optimistic, right, because of certain things. However, the Prophet ﷺ was not one who engaged in superstition, and superstition of course is haram. Seeing certain signs in the creation and believing that this is indicative of either something bad, it's either a bad omen or a good omen, right? Superstitions such as horoscopes and the like of this, it is haram, and this is bad character with Allah, believing that the creation has an effect on the decree of Allah Azza wa Jal, like the instance we mentioned earlier on, wherein the Prophet ﷺ's son Ibrahim passed on, and on that evening, in Kasafa al-Kusuf, on that evening there was a lunar eclipse, and some of the companions, because they were very early or in the early stages of belief and as being Muslims, they thought that this was as a result of the death of the Prophet ﷺ's son, and the Prophet ﷺ rectified this belief immediately, that the sun or the moon was not eclipsed because of the death of the Prophet's son, but this was a phenomena which Allah Azza wa Jal causes to happen. So the Prophet ﷺ was not one who used to engage in superstition, وَيُعْجِبُهُ الْإِسْمُ الْحَسَنِ, but the Prophet would become amazed, and he would like good names. He would like good names. So this would cause the Prophet to become optimistic, not based upon signs in the creation, but rather when he would hear good names. Another narration which describes to us the character of the Prophet ﷺ, and this describes to us the way the Prophet interacted with his companions and the way the Prophet ﷺ addressed people. It is a narration of Amr ibn al-As, wherein he said that the Prophet ﷺ, when addressing him, the Prophet ﷺ would face him directly, and the Prophet ﷺ would speak to him up until he would think that he was the best of people. Subhanallah. So the Prophet would speak to those companions whom other companions were greater than them. For example, as we will see in this narration, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, Ali. However, when the Prophet would speak to those companions who were lesser in status, and all companions have a great status with Allah Azza wa Jal, some greater than others, the Prophet would address them in a way that would make them feel special and would make them feel as if they were the best of people. And so Amr ibn al-As says, he asked the question, Ya Rasulullah, ana khayrun aw Abu Bakr? He asked the Prophet the question, am I better or is Abu Bakr better than me? The Prophet mentions Abu Bakr, and this is the clear statement of the Prophet that mentions the virtue of Abu Bakr. Abu Bakr is the best of this ummah. After the Prophets, Abu Bakr is the greatest of Allah Azza wa Jall's creation. Amr ibn al-As asked this question once more, and he says, Ana khayrun aw Umar? And am I better or is Umar better than me? The Prophet responded by saying, Umar. Amr ibn al-As asked a third time, O Messenger of Allah, Ana khayrun aw Uthman? Am I better or is Uthman better than me? The Prophet responded by saying, Uthman radiyallahu ta'ala anhum jami'an. Uthman is better than you. About this, Amr ibn al-As said, فَلَمَّا سَأَلْتُ رَسُولَ اللَّهِ صَدَّقَنِي فَلَوَدِدْتُ أَنِّي لَمْ أَكُنْ أَسْأَلُهُ. So he said, when I asked the Prophet ﷺ regarding these individuals, صَدَّقَنِي, he declared what I thought as to be the truth. فَلَوَدِدْتُ أَنِّي لَمْ أَكُنْ أَسْأَلُهُ. So he said, I wish that I had not asked the Prophet ﷺ this question. However, Amr ibn al-As is a great companion of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ as well, and this is a narration found in Tirmidhi وحسنه الباني رحمه الله تعالى. Another narration which mentions to us the beautiful description of the character of the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam, it is a narration where Sayyidina Aisha mentions that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam خير رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم بين أمرين قط إلا اختار أيسرهما. That the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was not given a choice between two matters, except he always chose the easier of the two paths. The Prophet ﷺ was not presented with two options, except he always chose the easier of the two. مَا لَمْ يَكُنْ إِثْمًا, as long as it would not be based upon sin, as long as this decision did not contain sin. So sometimes we look for loopholes in our deen, in our sharia, and we try to make things work for us. And sometimes we are doing this and we are actually committing a sin. The Prophet ﷺ would not be given a choice between two matters, except he would always choose the easier of the two. مَا لَمْ يَكُنْ إِثْمًا, as long as this option did not contain sin. فَإِنْ كَانَ إِثْمًا كَانَ عَبْعَدَ النَّاسِ مِنْ, if it did contain sin, the Prophet ﷺ would be the most distant from this. وَمَنْ تَقَمَ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمْ لِنَفْسِهِ فِي شَيْءٍ قَطْ إِلَّا أَن تُنْتَهَكْ حُرْمَةُ اللَّهِ فَيَنْتَقِمْ لِلَّهِ بِهَا. The Prophet ﷺ would never ever seek revenge on behalf of himself. The Prophet ﷺ was not vengeful. The Prophet ﷺ would never ever seek revenge on behalf of his own self. قط, ever, except if the prohibitions and the laws of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala were transgressed, and in these instances the Prophet ﷺ would then seek vengeance. So if people harm the Prophet ﷺ, and we see this from many instances where the Prophet ﷺ pardons those people who harmed him, those people who killed his family, and those people who were harsh to the Prophet ﷺ, the Prophet forgave. However, if people transgressed the limits of Allah Azza wa Jal, the Prophet also would seek revenge for the sake of Allah Azza wa Jal. And so this describes to us once again many characteristics of the Prophet. That the Prophet ﷺ would be the most distant from sin, and the Prophet ﷺ was not one who was very vengeful. Somebody did something to me, you'll see, I'll get him one day. This was never the approach of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Another narration which mentions to us the description of the Prophet's character is a narration in Muslim. And Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, she says that ما ضرب رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم شيئا قط بيده. The Prophet never ever strike anything بيده, with his hand. So subhanallah, people get angry. How do we react? We might smash the wall, we might break a glass, we might strike someone. A'udhu billah. Wala imra'ah. The Prophet also did not ever strike a lady with his hand. So the Prophet ﷺ was the foremost in advocating the rights of women and to make us aware of domestic abuse. This is our messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Wala khadima. Nor did the Prophet ﷺ ever beat a servant or a slave, as we would see, which was a common practice of the people, that they would beat their slaves in the time of the Prophet and after this. Illa ay yujahida fi sabilillah, except when the Prophet ﷺ strove in the way of Allah to make the kalima of La ilaha illallah reign supreme. Then Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would strike people with his hand. This is the exception. However, the Prophet never ever struck anything with his hand, nor a lady, nor a servant. إلا أن يجاهد في سبيل الله وما نيل منه شيء قط فينتقم من صاحبه إلا أن تنتهك شيء من محارم الله فينتقم لله. And the Prophet ﷺ was never faced with any harm that caused him to take revenge from the person who caused him harm, except in the one instance which I mentioned previously, that the rights of Allah Azza wa Jal would be transgressed, and then the Prophet ﷺ would take revenge for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. For the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Another narration that mentions to us the beautiful description of the character of the Prophet ﷺ was an instance wherein the Prophet's servant, and his name was Anas ibn Malik, said, the Prophet ﷺ كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم من أحسن الناس خلقا. The Prophet Muhammad was one of the best of people in terms of his character. فأرسلني يوما لحاجة. And so one day the Prophet sent me to fulfill a need for him. فقلت والله لا أذهب. So I said to myself, I will not go. However, وفي نفسي أن أذهب. However, I told myself I would go. لما أمرني به نبي الله. When the Prophet of Allah commanded me with this, I would do it. So he mentions فخرجت حتى أمر على صبيان وهم يلعبون في سوق فإذا برسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم بقفايا من ورائي فنظرت إليه وهو يضحك. So he said, and so I went to fulfill the need of the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم up until I passed by a group of children. Anas himself was a child. وهم يلعبون في سوق, and they were playing in the area where the marketplace was designated. فإذا برسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. And so whilst Anas got caught up playing with him, the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم caught up with Anas from behind. فنظرت إليه وهو يضحك. And Anas looked at the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم, and he found that the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم was laughing, because he knew that this was a child, and he got caught up. When the Prophet sent him to do something, he caught up and he started playing. The Prophet then said, يا أنيس ذهبت حيث أمرتك. You went as I ordered you, as I ordered you to fulfill something for me. Did you do it? Anas ibn Malik responded, أنا أذهب يا رسول الله. I am going, O Messenger of Allah. And Anas then said, والله لقد خدمت 9 سنين ما علمته قال لشيء صنعته لما فعلت كذا وكذا ولا عاب علي شيئا قط والله ما قال لي أف قط. Anas describes the Prophet's character, and he says, by Allah, I served the Prophet ﷺ for 9 years, and I did not know of him ever to blame me for something which I did wrong. لما فعلت كذا. Why did you not do such? Or why did you do such and such? ولا أبى علي شيئا قط. Nor did he blame me for anything which I might have done wrong. والله ما قال لي أف قط. The Prophet also never ever said to me uff. And this was someone who lived very close and intimately with the Prophet ﷺ. So if there was to be a discrepancy, which there could never be from the Prophet ﷺ, Anas ibn Malik would have known this, radiallahu ta'ala anhu. And so this really describes to us what Allah Azza wa Jalla mentions, وَإِنَّكَ لَعَلَى خُلُقٍ عَظِيمٍ. O Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, indeed you are upon an exalted standard of character. And so the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he won the love of his companions by way of his good character. And as we mentioned in the verse found in Surah Al-Imran, verse 159, فَبِمَا رَحْمَةٍ مِّنَ اللَّهِ لِنْتَ لَهُمْ. It was by the mercy of Allah that you showed gentleness towards them. وَلَوْ كُنْتَ فَضًّا غَلِيظَ الْقَلْبِ لَانْفَضُّوا مِنْ حَوْلِكَ. And had you been harsh and hard-hearted, they would have fled from you. So this characteristic of the Prophet ﷺ, it won hearts. and generally the character of the Prophet ﷺ, it won hearts. Without people knowing who the Prophet was, being in his presence and seeing his character, the Prophet ﷺ would win hearts. And this is the power of having good character for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. One more instance we'd like to share with you, bi'idhnillah, is a beautiful story of a person who was an enemy of Islam, who then becomes one of the great companions of the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. That was Thumama ibn Uthalin. Thumama ibn Uthalin, who was the leader or the chieftain of the people of Yamama. And so Thumama was captured by the Prophet Muhammad's companions during one expedition. And so they kept him in the place in the masjid which was designated for captives. The Prophet Muhammad then came to him and he told his companions, "Do you know who this person is who we have caught? It is the leader of the people of Yamama. So what a good captive we have." And so the Prophet Muhammad asked him a question, and he says, "Mada indaka ya Thumama?" He asked him the question, and he says, "What can you offer, O Umama? What can you offer? You are our enemy, you declared war with us, so what can you offer us?" فَقَالَ إِنْدِي يَا مُحَمَّدْ خَيْرٍ. So he said, "I have lots of good to offer, O Muhammad." He says, "In tuqtal ذا damin." He said, if you were to kill me and execute me as being a prisoner of war, in tuqtal ذا damin, you will kill someone of noble blood. وَإِن تُنْئِمْ عَلَى شَاكِرٍ. And if you want out of your noble bounty to pardon and to forgive me, then you will forgive someone who will show gratitude and will be grateful. وَإِن كُنْتَ تُرِيدُ الْمَالِ فَسَلْ تُعْطَى مِنْهُ مَا شِئْتَ. And if it is wealth that you want, ask and you shall be given what you want. And so the Prophet leaves off Umama, and he returns the next day and he asks him the exact same question. And Thumama responds in the same way. The Prophet leaves off again and he comes back a third and he asks the same set of questions again. And Thumama responds in the same way once again. After this, the Prophet he consults his companions and he says, "Atliqu Thumama." He says, "Release him. Release Thumama." And so فانطلق ثمامة فاغتسل ثم دخل المسجد فقال. And so Thumama leaves the masjid and he leaves the area where Masjid Nabawi is situated, and he goes to the area of Baqi, the graveyard in Medina, and he finds a place there and he performs a ghusl and he washes him. So the Prophet set him free, he could go to his people. Thereupon he enters the masjid and he says, "Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluh." And he says, "I bear witness that none has a right to be worshipped except Allah, and Muhammad is his servant and messenger." And so this is the realization that Umama came to by himself. And he says, "Ya Muhammad, wallahi ma kana ala al-ardi wajhun abghada ilayya min wajhik." He says, "O Muhammad," he says, "by Allah, there was never a person on the face of the earth whose face was more hated by me than your face." And he says, فَقَدْ أَصْبَحَ وَجْهُكَ أَحَبَّ الْوُجُوهِ كُلِّهَا إِلَيَّ. And he says, your face has become the most beloved of faces to me. And he says, وَمَا كَانَ مِنْ دِينٍ أَبْغَضَ إِلَيَّ مِنْ دِينِكَ. And there was not a religion which was more hated by me than your religion. فَأَصْبَحَ دِينُكَ أَحَبَّ الدِّينِ كُلِّهِ إِلَيَّ. And he says, your religion has become the most beloved religion out of all religions to me. And he says, وَاللَّهِ مَا كَانَ مِنْ بَلَدٍ أَبْغَضَ إِلَيَّ مِنْ بَلَدِكَ. And there was no land or city which was more hated by me than your city. فَأَصْبَحَ بَلَدُكَ أَحَبَّ الْبِلَادِ كُلِّهَا إِلَيَّ. And so your city has become the most beloved of cities to me. ولما قدم المكة قال له قائل أصابوت قال لا ولكني أسلمت. And Thumama said that I have submitted to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this was because of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam's good interaction and character which he showed Thumama during this time of being held as a captive. And so this is the power of good character. And as we mentioned, when it comes to good character, the Muslims, myself and yourself, we have the best of examples in the character of the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. So we pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guides us to righteous deeds, and He guides us towards the best of good character, because there's no one that can guide to this except Him subhanahu wa ta'ala. We end upon this note, inshaAllah. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuhu.